Meanwhile, we've also allowed private equity firms and other big financial institutions to buy up on the cheap, huge inventories of homes that have been foreclosed upon and hence don't have residents. There are entire neighborhoods now that have nobody living in them, but have a huge housing stock that's owned by BlackRock. And then, of course, I saw what the fucking Democratic Party itself did to Bernie, right? They made sure that he didn't get it, right? I think he would have won in 2020, right? I mean, in 2016, maybe in 2020 as well. But in any event, now, of course, we see what the payback for that is. That the fact that they went, kind of Hillary Biden instead of Bernie, I think is actually directly responsible for Trump's having won out last, in November. And I don't think this is a particularly novel position either. It seems like a lot of people see it this way, right?
And a lot of your recent work, including what we've read for today, you make a set of proposals for specific reforms for the Fed system.
Yeah.
Could you unpack that for us?
Yeah, sure. So we're into sort of part two then? Great, great, great. So this is the socialization of investment paper then, in a sense, that we're talking about, or the content of that paper. Although I've been sort of pushing this stuff in so many different venues that if you read anything with my name on it, you probably encountered something along these lines. So the basic idea here is that it seems to me that the time is ripe for a kind of reconfiguration of the entire national banking and financial systems in a manner that links them up to production again, as they used to be, right, up until the early 20th century, right? And the argument that I make for this is sort of partly based on what we've talked about over the time that we've been together thus far. But it's also based on a few other considerations that I think complement those and that interact with those. The primary new thing from the second paper that new for our purposes, for purposes of this conversation that I haven't mentioned yet, that I'll sort of especially underscore before then getting to the specific reforms, is a particular phenomenon to which a disaggregated, decentralized monetary system or financial system tends to be prone, and that for some reason has gone unnoticed. This phenomenon is what I refer to as a recursive collective action problem. Right? This is so familiar to this. I should say this is so accessible even to orthodox intuition that it astonishes me that no economist has noticed this or said anything about it, even as recently as, 100, even as long ago as say 100 years ago or more. But it just hasn't for whatever reason, right? So orthodoxy is familiar with the notion of just a generic collective action problem, right? The hallmark there is it's a choice situation in which everybody's making the individually rational choice aggregates into a situation that is collectively irrational, right? So each of us acts rationally. Our acting rationally on that individual basis leads to this sort of collectively futile or self-subverting or again irrational outcome. The usual examples are fairly familiar, I think, probably to everybody, right? So the person who sort of shouts fire in the crowded theater sparks a bum's rush for the door. Everybody in a certain sense is acting individually rationally. They're running for the door, but everybody's doing that at once, creates a bottleneck, so then everybody ends up being trapped and burns to death, right? The best known case is probably the so-called prisoner's dilemma, where each individual prisoner is making the sort of following what they call the dominant strategy, i.e. is doing the sort of individually optimally rational thing. But if they both act individually rational in that way, they basically end up harming themselves as a kind of duo or as a sort of pair. This is a common form of what the orthodox economists will call market failure, right? And there's all sorts of examples that are given, although they usually fall back on the prisoner's dilemma game. I don't know why. A recursive collective action problem, as I define it, is just a situation of that sort, but where the choice situation is iterated, right? Where you make a choice at time t+1 that is responsive to what happened at time t. Then at T2, you make a decision that is responsive to what happened at T1, and so on. And in a case like that, what happens is that with each iteration, the harmfulness of the collectively irrational outcome is deepened, is just worsened, right? And what's sort of fascinating is that so many difficulties that are sort of familiar to the world of finance and macroeconomics basically have this structure, right? So think of a consumer price inflation, for example, right? We all notice, for example, that let's say that the price of eggs is higher today than it was yesterday, and we noticed yesterday that it was higher, than it was on Thursday. And maybe we see this for several days, and we think, it might make sense for me to buy just a bunch of eggs today instead of waiting until I use these to come back and get more. Maybe I should buy 3 cartons instead of one or whatever. And then if the good in question is less perishable than eggs, you might be even more inclined to do that. Oh, I have a good way to store bread so that it doesn't get moldy. I have a giant freezer in the basement or whatever. So bread prices have been going up. So I'll just buy tons of bread now instead of a little bread. Or I'll buy tons of meat and freeze it in my freezer now rather than just a little bit. And that's an individually rational thing, of course, for you to do, right? But the key here is, of course, that it's rational for every other individual too. And if we all do that, then we actually accelerate the price rises in the meat markets or the bread markets or the egg markets even more, right? In a more explicitly financial context, this is all that a bank run is, right? Or a so-called fire sale of perceivedly toxic financial assets, as happened in 2008, right? Final example, think about an unemployment-induced recession or an unemployment-worsened recession, right? So you're a business, you have a workforce, you pay them wages, and let's say that for whatever reason, something begins to bring about a slowdown in the economy. So there's a little bit less purchasing going on. So your sales take a hit. That means your profits take a hit. At some point, you have to start lowering your costs. Otherwise, you're going to be operating at a loss. And so you individually rationally lay off some of your workforce, maybe temporarily, maybe for longer, maybe you fire them, maybe you lay them off. And in a certain sense, you're doing the individually rational thing because you're cutting your costs, right? But then every other bloody firm is doing the same thing. And so suddenly the unemployment rate in aggregate is spiking. And that, of course, curtails aggregate demand even more. There's even less purchasing going on. And so your revenues take an even bigger hit. So you lay off more workers and so on and so forth. And that's, of course, the classic recessionary, oftentimes even depression type spiral. And the key to it, again, is that each individual is doing the rational thing. I can't single-handedly end the recession by not furloughing my workforce. You can't single-handedly stop the price of bread from rising by refusing to buy 10 loaves today, but instead continuing to buy 1 loaf today. You can't individually affect this situation. But, and so you keep doing it. But if everybody's doing that, then it's, we have that catastrophic outcome. Now, the way that you address a collective action problem of any kind, and especially a recursive one, is through an exercise of collective agency, right? And we have this kind of cute, quaint old word that we used to use to describe collective agents. We call them governments, right? Governmental authorities, right? The state or some other kind of authorized collective agent. And it seems to me that it's kind of important that we sort of remember that now. And here's why. The financial markets or the money capital markets are particularly prone, right, to these kinds of problems. And now I'm going to think not just in terms of the downside, financial panics and the like, which we're all quite familiar with, and which I suspect you can all see without any explanation at all how those might constitute recursive collective action problems of that kind, right? If you can see how a bank run would be that, then you can see how a run on any market, any asset market might be that way. But what's more interesting and maybe less likely to be noticed spontaneously is that even on the upside, there's a problem here. And I sort of alluded to it earlier. And that is, let's say that you're an individual who has significant savings. Maybe you've got a significant surplus. You earn a lot more than you spend and got big savings. And you're sort of wondering what you should do with those, right? Should you deploy them in some way? Should you invest them in some way? And let's say you have 2 options before you, right? Somebody says, well, if I put together a portfolio of financial securities for you that I construct, fully informed by all of the latest advances in portfolio selection theory, by diversifying it properly on the one hand, and making sure that a sizable portion of the portfolio is in assets that do, have some kind of likelihood of rising in value really quickly. Well, I can pretty much assure you of at least a 10% annual return on your investment. and might even be quite a bit more than that, might be 12, 14, 15. But we actually have documentation from Jeremy Siegel in particular, who's been doing this for ages, and he can show quite exhaustively that the average return on just a well-diversified portfolio of equity securities is 10% per annum, right, over time. And again, if you're a little bit more adventurous, you can pretty easily get that up to 30 or 40% if you're willing to live with the fact that it's not a sure thing, but it still might happen. And if you can be patient and do that for a while. In any event, that's one of your options. The other option is you can invest in this company that is going to install high-speed rail, right, between San Francisco and Los Angeles, and then it's going to start connecting other cities. But it's going to take a little while, right, to get the thing built. And then it's going to take a while for it to sort of earn enough in the way of profits to sort of pay off all of the sunk costs that went into the building of it. So as an investor in this, you'll probably start seeing returns maybe within about 7 or 8 years, right? Well, a lot of people will find it individually rational to choose the first option rather than the second, right? And the first option, the thing that we forget, of course, Wall Street doesn't want you to forget this or wants us not to notice this, is that in effect, what's going on with that first portfolio is people are placing bets on price movements. And that's rendered possible by another feature of our modern capital markets that I also sort of accentuate in this socialization of investment paper, and that's their stratified character, right? We have markets and we have meta markets, and we have meta markets and meta markets. I mean, basically the orders keep rising, right? We go more meta, it seems, with every passing year. And what's going on there, anytime there's, let's say a third order market relative to a second order market, or an n-1th order market relative to an nth order market, is essentially a market where you can bet on the movements of prices in the market just below, right? And that's what we seem to specialize in now, where Wall Street is concerned. And what all of these markets, all of these meta markets are, is sites, 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 where people bet on price movements in the markets below, right? And again, the thing that's attractive about this is that there's the distinct prospect of making quite a bit of money in a very short time. And again, if your time horizon is that of a human lifespan, and if moreover you've got wishes and needs and attractions that you'd like to have more money now for, rather than having to wait for 8 or 10 years for a high-speed rail network to begin turning a profit or whatever, that it's not going to be individually irrational and maybe not even individually immoral for you to go that route, right? But the thing is, if that's the way it is for you, then that's probably the way it is for a lot of other people. And so there's a built-in tendency in our disaggregated, not centralized financial markets for the money disproportionately to flow in that direction, right? Which is not a productive direction. It's a price inflating direction, right? So the argument, the institutional reforms that I push are designed essentially to kind of deal with that problem in a way that can then be productive for our entire society. And so what I do is I start by partitioning that sort of endogenously generated part of the credit money supply on the one hand, and the bona fide exogenously sourced money on the other hand, right? And I call the first piece the public capital supply, right? And thinking of capital here as money capital, to use Marxian terms, right? So I call that the public capital supply, and then the legitimately exogenously sourced supply we can call the private supply. Now, as I've already argued before, and we'll argue again now, is the public capital supply, if you look at it in this way, is just much, 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 much larger, right, than the private capital supply. It seems to me that what we ought to do now is, basically recognize this fact, which again, the financial services industry will do anything to prevent you from noticing it or knowing about it, let alone doing anything about it. And all of their, hacks in the academy are also going to make sure that you feel stupid if you say this, like, you can't possibly know what you're talking about. Don't worry your pretty little head over this. Allow me to finance-splain to you the error of your ways. But we have to tell those people to go fuck themselves. Sorry, we have to, ignore those people and look at the way things actually are. And then what we do is we say, okay, we're going to put the public capital supply under explicit public management. And then we're going to let the private capital supply indeed be under private management. That's fine. There's only so much harm they can do when it's that small a portion of the total. And even if all it's doing is just basically causing a lot of those rich money bags people to lose their livelihoods or lose their fortunes, fine. We don't really have to worry about that as a public. But what we do have to do is worry about the proper allocation. And if you get the allocation right, you're probably going to get the modulation largely right too. The public allocation and modulation of the public credit supply. And it seemed to me that there are a number of institutional reforms that we can make that will make this possible. Now, back up 1/2 second. Let me emphasize there are lots of different imaginable institutional configurations through which we could do this, right? If we wanted to build a completely new financial system from scratch, we could design something from scratch that would be beautiful and elegant and would work quite well. The strategy that I've employed just as a sort of political calculation more than anything else is instead to find institutions that we have already that a minimal number of tweaks or adjustments to could convert them into precisely what we need. And it turns out that we have a number of institutions like that. And partly it's no accident. Partly the reason we have some institutions like that is that there was a time when we understood better as a society the nature of the money system than we do now, right? So with the Fed, for example, that's the low-hanging fruit here. So quickly on the spread the Fed thing is what I've suggested, what I propose in the book, and also in the article that you guys have read, is if we reinstate the original role of the regional Federal Reserve banks as monetizers of productively extended loans or other forms of credit, and if they employ the criteria of productiveness as distinguished from merely speculative that those regional banks were employing before the 1920s, we'll get an awful lot of the allocation right there, right? So that's one thing we can do. A second thing we can do is we have actually a sort of rump version of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that did all the financing of the rebuilding during the Depression and during the Second World War mobilization. If we had more time, I'd go into a lot more detail on the RFC, which is an amazingly cool institution that was actually turning a profit while revitalizing and rebuilding the entire economy. But precisely because it was public sector and looked kind of communist in that way, in 1947, when the Cold War was beginning to sort of gather steam, a bunch of Congress members thought, hey, how can we fight, how can we argue that communism is a bad thing when our biggest and most profitable and most successful bank is itself a communist bank? So they dismembered it and left a few of its subsidiaries in place. One of those was Fannie Mae. Another was the Small Business Administration. We have a few subsidiaries still of it, but of course the private sector is busily trying to snap those up too. But in any event, RFC, ultra cool. It turns out we have a kind of rump RFC already that we could turn into something as cool as the original RFC. It's called the Federal Financing Bank, the FFB, which is housed within the Treasury Department. And all we would have to do, the only tweaks we would have to do to the RFC to turn it into a development bank, is essentially add some options as far as the intake of funding is concerned, and then add some options as far as the sort of investing, the output is concerned. And that's described to some degree in the paper that you guys will have seen. But the FFB could essentially then be really quickly, it would take very little time. Technically, it's just a snap to sort of convert into a sort of fully fledged RFC again. In any event, to put the whole package together, the complete sort of set, those are the two, the spread fed and the revitalized and upgraded FFB I led with, just because those are two conspicuous examples of what I was talking about a moment ago when I said, if it turns out that we already have proto versions of the institutions that are needed and that all that we have to do is tweak them to make them full-fledged versions of that, it's probably strategically a good thing to do. And by the way, to sort of just a quick aside to sort of lend credence to the plausibility of what I've just suggested, I put together a bill, right? I think it's referenced in the paper, that back in late 2020 and early 2021, that basically lays out the entirety of what I'm just about to sort of finish laying out. And I managed to get both Ro Khanna, Democrat in the House from California, and Marco Rubio, of all people, a senator from Florida, both to co-sponsor it. And they proposed it. They proposed it in Congress in December of 2022. So the very fact, right, that Lil Marco on the one hand and Big Ro on the other hand are both in favor of it suggests to me that it's not completely implausible either, as a matter of logistics or as a matter even of politics, right? But anyway, on to the slightly more systematic but still brief and concise sort of layout of the whole plan. So I was thinking, what we want to do first off is we want to have some kind of public-private collaboration in the formulation of a national development strategy, right? You need a sort of an overview planner, a kind of a loose planner for the economy as a whole, because of course technologies are constantly changing, constantly advancing, and they interact in various ways. And it seems to me that we ought to get deliberate about future developments of technologies and the sort of what kinds of markets in what goods and services do we want in the future? What are some of our sort of social imperatives where we want to make sure that we have optimal financing and optimal facilitation for, like green energy, for example, things of that sort. And so it occurred to me that what we could do is we could replicate, we could put together a contemporary version of the New Deal's war planning or war production board, which combined, various private sector folk with various public sector folk as a kind of an oversight planning body for the national mobilization in the Second World War. We could put together a modern version of that that's not about war this time, but it's about something equally urgent, if not indeed more urgent at this point. And I call it a National Development Council or a National Reconstruction and Development Council, an NRDC. That's the sort of the umbrella entity. We actually do something like that for national defense already, right? We have essentially a National Security Council whose job is to sort of coordinate and partly plan the operations of every other defense entity in our government. And I thought, why aren't we sort of equally coordinative and strategic about the peaceful side of the economy, the peaceful side of our sort of productive industries and the like? So it starts with that. There's a sort of another theoretical view that partly informs that idea, and it has to do with development, right? I mean, development economists, unfortunately, in the modern era, think of development as a sort of a one-off thing. It's a kind of switch flipping thing, right? You begin as undeveloped, then you flip a switch and you're developed, and then you're done, right? It's a one-off achievement. This is actually a product of the Cold War too, right? The person who came up with the takeoff idea for national development was Walt Rostow, an economist who was not in any economics related department. He was in the Defense Department in the 1960s. And his argument was, well, look, if we want to sort of outcompete the commies out there in the world, we have to help all these undeveloped former colonial countries to develop really quickly. And he even published a book called The Anti-Communist Manifesto or something along those lines. It was a deliberate echo of the Communist Manifesto. But the whole idea of development that he pushed was basically based on the state of development of these various former colonies. And all development economists ever since, for whatever reason, seem to think of their task as looking for some benighted, undeveloped country that they can help develop, and then it'll be done, right? So development as a done deal seems to be the orthodoxy, even to this day. And my argument is that no, development is never done, right? There's another piece I published a while ago that you guys might get a kick out of. It's called Dylanomics, and the subtitle of it gives you a clue as to why it's called Dylanomics. It's why economy's not busy being born or busy dying. It's just a line I took from a Dylan song. I think it was It's All Right, Ma, right? Where there's he not busy being born is busy dying. But the idea is, an economy should always be modernizing. There should always be a process of rapid assimilation and dissemination of all new technologies that are potentially helpful, right? And that's what we should view national development as being. And that means in turn that it's never a done deal. It's never a one-off achievement. It's an ongoing, never-ending project, right? So the idea of the National Reconstruction and Development Council is sort of also predicated on that view, in addition to being predicated on a certain institutional history in the form of the RFC, the WFC before that, and Lincoln's planners during the Civil War. In particular, I forgot what the role of the name of the institution was. It was the National Commissary or something like that. But in any event, then what it's charged with doing is coming up with a sort of an annually updated plan for ongoing national development. And so there'd be a national development policy statement, every year, in the same way that the National Security Council puts together a national defense posture statement every year. So regularly updated strategy and identification of priorities where we want to make sure enough credit is flowing. The FFB then becomes its sort of subsidiary. The upgraded FFB then is the financing arm of that council, in the same way that the RFC was the financing arm of the War Production Board during the World War II mobilization. So there you've got basically, direct public investment or the formation of pools of investment monies that private sector people can also contribute to. So you've got public money and private money going into it. Essentially just directly channel credit money or investment money in various directions where it's necessary to do. And you can think of that part of the plan, those two pillars, so to speak, as the sort of the direct public investment piece of the plan. Then part 3 is the spread Fed. And there you have a kind of combined public and private decision about investing, but not on big national projects, but more small businesses, the sort of privately ordered part of the economy. And essentially, it's just a revitalization of that earlier Fed role that I mentioned before. So you can have smaller banks, they can be private sector or public sector, who are ready to make loans that look likely to be productive, and in addition to being sort of being profitable or not loss type things, you can have them identifying recipients of that sort of credit. And then the Fed, the Federal Reserve regional banks, or also known as the district banks, will determine the eligibility for monetizability of those sorts of loans. And so it'll effectively be telling the banks, if the loans that you're extending meet our definition of productive, which will essentially be the definition that they used before the 1930s, then we will stand ready through our discount window to monetize the credit instruments that you hold in your portfolio, right? So it will be essentially encouraging and incentivizing through its standing ready to monetize productive investment, even by the private sector banks or the smaller banks, including perhaps public banks, right? Like the Bank of North Dakota. So that's what it does, right? That's plank number 3. Plank number 4 is to overhaul the payment system, the national payment system, right? And this is what I call the digital greenbacks system, by sort of deliberate analogy to the paper greenbacks that were introduced through the national banking system in the 1860s. So the idea here, and this has a really interesting personal story involved too, the idea here is the Treasury Department provides to everybody, every citizen or legal resident of the country, a digital wallet that can be used on a smartphone or smart device or laptop or you name it, iPhone, whatever it is. Everybody gets a digital wallet. These digital wallets will have P2P capacity, right? So I can direct a payment to Daniel. Daniel can direct a payment to me. Daniel might be a store, or he might just be a person, a human being, whatever Daniel is. If he's a legal person who can be paid or who can make payments, he has a wallet through which he can do that, right? So everybody gets one of those. Everybody then is able to make these payments to one another, as sort of that would just become the main national payment system. And that horizontal P2P sort of functionality of it is what would underwrite that. Crucially, though, it would also have a vertical dimension because it would be linked directly to the Treasury Department. The Treasury then, operating in coordination with the Fed, could inject more money into the economy when necessary during a slowdown or whatever, simply by crediting people's wallets, right? It could also work in the opposite direction. Probably wouldn't be politically saleable to say it could impound money in people's wallets, but it could do this instead. It could offer interest on people's wallet accounts in the same way that it pays interest to private sector banks who maintain reserve accounts with the Fed, right? we have so-called IOR, and we have had it since 2012, interest on reserves, where the Fed actually pays private sector banks to keep money in their Fed reserve accounts by paying interest on it. Well, you can see right away, as soon as you have that, you have a policy instrument too. You can raise that interest rate that's paid on the wallet accounts when you're trying to induce a little bit less spending activity to slow down the economy a bit if inflationary pressures begin to show up. And then if you want to incentivize more spending during, sort of slowdowns, you can either lower the interest rate on those wallets, or you can even suffuse, you can put more cash into them, you can put more money into them. In effect, one of the things that prompted my sort of looking into the feasibility of this was, of course, the COVID checks, right? You guys might remember about 5 years ago when they were sort of talking about sending out paper checks to everybody, there was a bit of hand-wringing first about the possibility that some people might not have addresses. It might be kind of hard to find them to get the paper checks to them. Other people worried that the paper might be a vector of the virus itself, which for a while people believed. And so there was all that sort of hand-wringing about all that. And so that was when I first thought of pushing this. I thought of pushing this a long time before that, but it was when I thought of making a political issue of it. So I called, I designed a plan that and I was wondering how quickly it could be put into place. So I called some people at US Digital Service, which you guys might know a little bit about, but it's an entity that's charged with sort of upgrading on a regular basis all of the tech that's used by various federal offices. Unfortunately, Trump and Musk have just sort of renamed it and repurposed it, but it shouldn't be that hard to put it back to what it was. But in any event, I talked to those people and I said, what would be the feasibility of doing something like the following? So I told them that there is already an infrastructure in place for this. It's called Treasury Direct. If you guys later on, maybe if you Google Treasury Direct, you will see that the Treasury Department already offers any of us who wants to the capacity to establish an account with Treasury through which we buy Treasury securities directly from the Treasury Department and in which we can redeem them, right, for money. Right. So anybody who wants a Treasury Direct account, even right now, already can get one. But they're not, there's no sort of app for people's smart devices to do this. And furthermore, you can't hold dollars in your TDA, in your Treasury Direct account. You have to have a private sector bank account that's connected to it. So that then when you redeem Treasury securities, Treasury simply credits your bank account. So what I suggested to USDS is I said, what if we'll call these digital greenbacks, sort of in honor of the original greenback. What if we were to convert all of the Treasury Direct accounts into, smart device accessible accounts, and we allowed people to keep dollars in those accounts along with Treasury securities? How long would it take to do this conversion of the existing Treasury Direct system and then create an app that anybody who wanted to could download onto their phones or other devices? And they said that'd probably be about 3 months. And that was flabbergasting, right? I asked them about this just as things were getting really nasty with COVID. So, early March, late February. And I thought by this summer, literally by the summer of 2020, all of us could have effing digital banking that's publicly provided by the Treasury Department. So maybe needless to say, this is then plank 4 of the plan, that we basically institute the Treasury Direct, or the sort of what I call the digital greenbacks plan, so that now we've rationalized and made much more efficient the national payment system, but also by doing that, we've made it easier for the first 3 planks of the plan to work, right? Because what we can do, let's say that FFB, operating under the aegis of the National Reconstruction and Development Council, decides that more money should be flowing in the direction of this, that, and the other industry to sort of jumpstart the green production or something like that. Well, then the Treasury could just simply directly credit people's digital greenback accounts, right? Their wallets, so that they could start using that money to start doing the investing, to start producing those capacities right away, right? Everything would be doable so quite quickly. So that's sort of plank 4. And then finally, there's a sort of an add-on plank 5 that I suggested that this is not as essential as the first 4, but it would be kind of helpful. I thought we could, if we have that architecture in place, right, that sort of digital greenback architecture in place, then another thing that we could do is as the national economy grows, and as the national tax take as a function of that grows with it, Treasury could actually pay out dividends to everybody, right? To enable the entire population to share in the nation's GDP growth, which I argue would be much more rapid if we had a system, this whole plan in place. And so everybody could receive, annual dividends on the national economy, so that if the economy, grows by 5 or 8 or 10% this year, everybody gets their pro rata share of that 8% or 10% or whatever. Or it could be less than the full, the full amount. Maybe you get half of that that incremental rise, and the other half is reinvested in the nation by the Treasury Department, in conjunction with the various cabinet level offices and the like. But if we have the architecture in place, that's another cool thing that we could do, that we could, in theory, sort of be doing now even, but nobody really thinks much about doing it because it's not really, we don't have a nice, clean, sort of easily imagined and mapped out national payments infrastructure. So we tend to think that we have less capacity than we really have, because if we sort of try to map out the capacity, it looks kind of complicated and convoluted. But if we simplify it through the digital greenbacks platform, then it's pretty easy to see both that this is doable and that it's desirable, a kind of national dividend paid out to everybody. And that's basically it in a nutshell. So I guess I should stop again then, Hephaestion, and we can do
Let's go into Q&A. So there's a lot. Yeah, thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thanks so much. And I know there's a lot there. I kind of worry that heads might be swimming. Certainly mine is, even when I remember it all. So,
yeah. I'm sure a lot of us have questions or things we'd like to clarify. So Bradley, let's start with you.
Thanks, and thanks for joining us and for the interesting read. And like I was saying before, I see there's a lot more of your work that I'd be interested in, and it was all kind of interlinked in the footnotes. So very cool.
Good, thanks, Bradley.
I have a million questions, but one that something I didn't understand and that maybe will be helpful for everyone. So you were talking about these kind of collective action. What was it, calamities or predicaments, the caps, and sort of like the tragedy of the commons, and how this system can, by kind of helping to drive investment towards, or money towards productive investment, could kind of avoid some of that, if I'm understanding it. But for something like housing, which is already sort of an asset that has inflated in price and that's causing big problems, how does, because I guess I don't know if that's considered a productive investment because people need a house, or would we just need to build a lot of houses? Or maybe better yet, I'll just ask, where does that fit into your sort of framework, and how would it help or be solved?
Yeah, what a great question, Bradley. Thanks so much. So you might not be terribly surprised to learn that, or to hear that, sort of the first area in which I began to sort of write as a scholar right out of school was in the history of our system of national housing finance. Right? And indeed, what we have in place for home finance, or at least what we had in place until the 1990s, after the 1930s, was a system that was in many ways, quite similar to what I'm pushing for the economy as a whole. Right? Essentially, what we did was, before the Great Depression began, fewer than 40% of American households owned their own homes. And there were two basic reasons for this. The first was that you couldn't buy a house unless you could put at least 50% down, right? LTV's maximum loan to value ratios were 50%. Relatedly, you could only get a loan to do this for about 5 years, and then you'd have to refi. So basically, people had to turn over their and refinance their mortgage loans every 5 years. There was just no credit institution, no banking institution that would make loans for longer terms than that. So one of the first things that the new Roosevelt administration, and actually even the late Hoover administration, sort of saw this, they just didn't go big on it. A lot of what Roosevelt did was basically take cool ideas that Hoover had come up with, but then lever them up by 100%, or by 100 times or whatever, right? So Hoover had really great creative ideas, but he was too cautious, too wimpy about actually implementing them. So Roosevelt comes in with his big personality, goes, "That's a capital idea. Why don't we do 10 times as much as that?" But in any event, what they figured out was, okay, the national credit housing credit market is the way it is, partly because it's fragmented. Everything is subject to state law, and partly also because no private sector lending institution is willing to take the risk necessary to take on in order to prove that something cooler is possible. So they established through the Federal Housing Act in 1934 a new agency called the Federal Housing Administration. And what FHA did to begin with was they said, look, we will offer complete default insurance on mortgage loans extended by banks, provided that the loans have the following attributes. One of the attributes is they had to be 30-year term loans. You had to give the buyer 30 years, right, to sort of pay down the loan. And the other was that the house in question had certain quality characteristics so that it wasn't likely to be a clapboard that was going to fall apart in 10 minutes or whatever. It had to be a quality house. And what that did is it sort of overnight transformed the federal home finance markets, because now banks knew that they could unload. There was not only that insurance that was offered, but then the complementary institution was created shortly thereafter. This was Fannie Mae in 1938, and Fannie Mae was what we would in finance parlance call a secondary market maker. So what Fannie was created to do, and again, it was public sector at the outset, was if you do extend loans like this and you do get the FHA insurance, but you want to get them off your books, if you're a bank, you want to get them off your portfolio because you need more liquidity for certain purposes, we'll buy them from you. You can just unload them. You can offload them on us. And as long as they meet those qualifications that you had to meet to get the FHA insurance in the first place, we'll buy them. And between them, then, what FHA and Fannie did was they made it now possible. First, they created in effect, they created a new standardized nationwide mortgage instrument, the 30-year fixed rate that we've all sort of heard about. And because it was standardized, it could trade on secondary markets, and furthermore, could readily be bought up by Fannie Mae, right, as the sort of ultimate secondary market maker. And so that made it much easier for banks to go ahead and make mortgage loans, right? And made it much easier, therefore, for people to get those loans. And so we almost overnight were transformed from a country where fewer than 40% of households own their own homes to one in which close to 70% did. It was simply by taking advantage of the fact that some things are just too big for a private sector to sort of handle. So what happened after that, of course, is, as you know, is Fannie Mae was privatized. They lowered the standards when it came to what kinds of loans they would make. FHA was largely sort of neutralized or defanged by Republican administrations that came later. And so now we have a home finance system that has some of the advantages still that were introduced in the 30s, but that has lost a lot of them. Meanwhile, we've also allowed private equity firms and other big financial institutions to buy up on the cheap, huge inventories of homes that have been foreclosed upon and hence don't have residents. There are entire neighborhoods now that have nobody living in them, but have a huge housing stock that's owned by BlackRock. So, and that means we have an artificial scarcity of residential homes. There's not a scarcity as far as the actual equipment or the actual physical things are concerned, but there's a shortage in the sense that they're kept off market. In effect, what BlackRock and these other entities are doing is something that we used to treat as illegal. They're cornering a market, right? Jay Gould got in trouble for basically cornering the silver market so that he could then artificially inflate the price of silver in the 19th century. The same fucking thing is being done with the housing stock right now, and nobody's saying anything about it, let alone doing anything about it. So the way this sort of connects up with my sort of plan then is, for one thing, you do need to do something additional to the plan, and that is you have to illegalize the holding of housing stock by fucking Wall Street institutions. It just shouldn't be permitted. Indeed, it seems to me that there's a definite number of basic human needs that we could just say as a matter of national policy are not going to be subject to markets where the profit motive is a driver or is active. And that should include housing, it should include food, it should include health, it should include nursing homes, it should include education at the very least, right? And this is one. So I actually wrote a bill for Roe. It seems like most of what I used to do a lot of legislation writing for AOC and for Bernie, but they seem to be less active in those spaces now. And now Ro Khanna is the one I'm doing all this for because he's constantly asking for it. But I wrote for them back in 2022 a Stop Wall Street Landlords Act that they introduced into Congress, but of course hasn't gone anywhere. But what it would do is, first of all, of course, it would prohibit Fannie Mae or FHA from assisting with any purchases of properties, residential properties by Wall Street institutions. It would also force the Wall Street institutions to divest their massive holdings of this sort by taxing them at like 100%. So basically, we're going to bankrupt you if you don't release this stuff onto the market. And then finally, the third part is we henceforth prohibit the purchases of any more of this sort of stuff by these kinds of institutions. So all of those measures, I think, are kind of, they complement my plan, but they're also, of course, in addition to it. Where my plan in particular comes into place here is another part of it, of course, is to sort of restore the original mission and the original ownership to Fannie Mae, right? There's a piece I wrote a while back that you guys might like. It's called Republican Home Owning. I published that through the St. Louis Fed, and if you Google that phrase and my name, you'll find it. It's all over the web, but it basically is just a restoration of the original Fannie Mae and a restoration of the original task of FHA. And you can think of those, I think, as quite complementary to what the broader plan that we're talking about right now does. Is that responsive?
That I was just, while I was reading, it was like, I feel like there's probably more, and it's not like your plan is to address every single crisis of capitalism, but that was one that came to mind, and that's a really satisfying answer. Thank you.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. Yeah, I guess you could say my intention is to address every such problem. And then this plan addresses a big chunk of it, but there are sort of separate things that I put out that deal with more particular elements. I'm probably getting to the point where I'm just going to say all of this planning is idle. The only real plan that would count is a communist revolution, but I guess we can leave that to one side for now.
Awesome. Thank you.
A lot of what I'm sort of coming to realize, somewhat to my consternation, that an awful lot of what I've thought was novel institutional invention on my part, and wonderful sort of comprehensive answers to the most difficult questions that have been facing us over the last 20 or 30 years, was all in slightly different form anticipated by a number of sort of Second International era Marxists, right? And as you might know, the big debate in the sort of, for the first maybe 20 years or so of the 20th century, maybe the first 15 years even, was between those who were sort of softer Marxists, who had come to the conclusion that you could achieve a socialization of the economy peacefully, versus those who continued to maintain that, no, it's going to have to be violent in one way or another. And on the first side of that divide, we have on the one hand Hilferding, Bauer, a few more of the so-called Austro-Marxists or Austrian Marxists, and then also, of course, the kind of the leaders of the so-called social democratic movement in Germany itself at that time, Karl Kautsky and Edvard Bernstein. And what all of these people seem to have had in common was that they saw, as Marx prophesied but couldn't see yet because it hadn't fully developed yet, that the so-called commanding heights of the economy just are the massive financial institutions, right? That basically big banking concerns had come to be the oligopolistic planners of the economy. You actually had economic planning, but it was done by these big financier types. And the so-called reformists, Bernstein, Kautsky, Hilferding, and the others, thought, oh, that's kind of cool, because that means all we would have to do in order to have a sort of almost instant or overnight socialization of the entire economy is to socialize the commanding heights, right? So you just basically seize the banks and the financial institutions. They've already done us the favor of blueprinting the entire economy. We can figure out where all the finances flow simply by looking at their balance sheets when we take them over. And so you can have a kind of a bloodless coup, in effect, simply by taking those institutions. On the other side, of course, you had Bukharin, Lenin, and to a certain extent, Rosa Luxemburg, who's a sort of an intriguing mediator between the two. She seems to have seen the attraction of the reformists, but she was more doubtful, as I think you and I might be at this point, that it was going to be possible for it to be entirely bloodless. So I'm going to lump her together then with Lenin and Bukharin for these purposes. They were fully cognizant of everything that the reformists were. They understood too, right, that the financial sector had now taken over everything. And so all you kind of really have to do is take over the financial sector and you can instantly socialize the economy. as, by the way, also figured in the Communist Manifesto itself, right? The 10 immediate steps that were advocated, one of them included immediately nationalizing the entire banking sector. Where they differed, I think, from those reformists, and hence, the reason that Lenin called Kautsky a renegade, and they're a traitor, was they thought it was sort of silly, or naive in the extreme to think that you could do this without at least threatening violence, right? Without threatening some kind of a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat or whatever. And I think we've come to a point, certainly at least I've come to the point, where I'm right back in the middle of that debate now. I myself don't know. I was previously, before recent things happened, I had this kind of cute pie in the sky, happy, optimistic sort of view. This is back when I was Bernie's finance guy in the 2016 and 2020 campaigns. I thought, well, we might win. And if we win, we'll just do this, right? So I was optimistic that maybe we could do the Kautsky thing. We could do the Edvard Bernstein thing. We could do the Hilferding thing. And then, of course, I saw what the fucking Democratic Party itself did to Bernie, right? They made sure that he didn't get it, right? I think he would have won in 2020, right? I mean, in 2016, maybe in 2020 as well. But in any event, now, of course, we see what the payback for that is. That the fact that they went, kind of Hillary Biden instead of Bernie, I think is actually directly responsible for Trump's having won out last, in November. And I don't think this is a particularly novel position either. It seems like a lot of people see it this way, right? But that has me wondering, right? I mean, all right, we gave it our shot. We tried to do this peacefully in the Hilferding way, but have we now been shown? Has it now been proved to us that no, that's just an exercise in silly self, fantasizing or something, and maybe it'll turn out that at the very least, maybe Luxemburg was right, and it was again sort of being midway between the Second International Marxists on the one hand and Lenin and Bukharin on the other, seemed to think that some kind of rebellious action is going to be necessary, but she put her hopes on what she called the mass strike, right? That basically everybody would just shut everything down by just not working. And then they would take over. I think that too might have been a little naive. It might be that gunshots have to be, we might have to hear gunshots in the streets before we get to where we need to be. I literally pray that that's not the case. But I have to say I'm much more Luxembourg now, whereas I was perhaps more Hilferding then. And the only question remaining is, can I rest on Luxembourg or do I have to go all the way to Lenin? So that's sort of the way it's all sort of looking to me at the moment. One possibility, and of course I hate to imagine this, and it's a horrifying thought in many ways, but I do wonder if that which finally brought about the real revolutions in Russia was, of course, the calamity of the First World War, and that same calamity almost got us a socialist Germany. It came really, really close in 1919. I wonder if the U.S. has to get its butt kicked by China or something to lead the general population finally to say, you fuckers in charge just don't know what the hell you're doing, and we shouldn't have put up with you as long as we did. And then we finally have our own version of the German Revolution of 1919, 1920. I hope that that's not what is necessary. I hope that doesn't turn out to be the way it happens. But it's at least a plausible prospect, isn't it? It's not completely implausible to imagine that. And so that, to me, that's sort of my worst best case scenario, so to speak. And my best case scenario is that something like the Luxembourgian mass strike is organized and resorted to, and then we can do a sort of overnight, almost bloodless, perhaps actually even literally bloodless, depending on what the reactions to the strike are, sort of changing of the guard. Is that responsive, Daniel? Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know if I have too much to add to that. My question was along the same lines, but maybe I can just list. I mean, there are a few ways that we imagine that big social changes, including revolutions, happen. One is the, I don't know, maybe sort of mythic or maybe a little naive idea of the people having had it rise up and take over. So maybe people think it's sort of disputed whether that's ever been the case, whether, you know, in the Russian Revolution or
Mhm.
anywhere else. The other story I've heard told, or that has been theorized, is that um, whether through technological change or some other reason, class forces realign, in which, you know, there's a burgeoning elite class that threatens an older one. So Marx sort of characterizes the French Revolution in this way.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the other way is the foreign threat,
Mhm.
or when the foreign threat becomes um, uh, uh, actual war.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think it could be either of those two. I think my personal hope is that the threat of a growing China is going to maybe um, uh, motivate some congressmen to wake up a little bit. I think when you
Yeah.
mentioned Marco Rubio, I think that
Yeah.
that's maybe the hope that I get. It's, or maybe the elite, or even the financial elite of the United States at least understand that the way the American economy is developing and the way China is developing, they, you know, there's no hope
Mhm.
of America
Mhm.
maintaining dominance internationally, and you know, preserving profits even domestically. So I don't know if, I don't know which of those forces could are the most promising. Um, and
Mhm.
um, you mentioned BlackRock.
Mm.
I wonder, you know, which which congressman isn't funded by
Right.
BlackRock or some similar, uh, you know, financial institution. So
Mhm.
I don't know if I have a real question, but I mean, maybe one thing I could ask you about, just if you have thoughts about this, is um, it does seem to me that there does have to be some sort of like class conflict at the elite level that motivates some sort of vigorous change. And
Mhm.
do
Mhm.
you see any divisions in the way, you know, financial institutions, you know, fund different political characters
Mhm.
or anything in that sphere that would gesture, maybe not directly to your proposal, but to some attempt to revitalize the American economy in a productive way?
Yeah, what a great question. I often say that I'm metabolically optimistic in the sense that I seem to be optimistic even when I can't give good reasons for it, and even when I can only give you lots of good reasons not to be that. Um, and so what I'm about to say is somewhat surprising to me, right? Um, I I think I have almost no hope left that any existing legislator will be able to do, or let alone any group of such legislators will be able to do what needs doing, sort of from the top. Um, I can, however, imagine something like the following maybe happening, which would involve some of those politicians, but wouldn't sort of be decisively dependent on them. It would just They would simply have a role in it, but a fairly subsidiary role. And it's something like this. So I've got another book that'll be coming out early this summer on what to do about the fact that pretty much the entire workforce is about to be rendered redundant, right? Right, and it's sort of the kind of informal title of this book is "Owning the Robots," but the basic idea is it's called A Republic of Producers. It's going to be put out by Yale University Press pretty soon, and the idea is to sort of financially engineer an economy in which all of the productive capital is owned by those who use it to produce. Right? Basically, there will no longer be a proletariat. Capital won't hire or rent labor any longer. Labor will either rent or own capital. Right? And this is not that difficult to financially engineer, it turns out. All that one has to do is sort of generalize the financial structure of the aforementioned home finance programs that were developed in the 1930s. And so the book is essentially a designing of that, showing how to do that, and also arguing why it would be politically, ideologically sustainable and the like. Now, in connection with that book, which is predicated on the thought that maybe politicians who exist now would find this desirable, and maybe they'll do it, I no longer have that particular hope, but I do have a closely related hope, and that is that if the AI revolution happens within the next year or so, rather than the next 5 years, or if it happens within the next 4 or 5 rather than the next 10 to 20, you can imagine, like if you've got an 80% unemployment rate or something, you're now going to have the makings of a kind of class consciousness, right? It's now going to be possible, it seems to me, to mobilize an immense portion of the population to make this happen. And they might not even have to be violent about it. If you're looking out your window as a politician and you see 80% of the entire working age population standing out there with pitchforks, you might very well see fit to sort of think of them as your constituents again, rather than BlackRock, right? And so that might be something, a kind of social upheaval or cataclysm that's short of war with China, but that is similarly or is comparably galvanizing, let's say, right? Because of course we know that the big challenge right now is that, I suppose you could say that attention is the most important resource, and it's the most scarce for us, right? I mean, in order to organize a national uprising or even a mass strike a la Rosa Luxemburg, you're going to have to get people to sort of look up away from their smartphones for a few minutes, right? And they can't be, looking at cats on TikTok or something. You really, we have to do something to kind of lengthen the national attention span, and maybe more importantly, unify and coordinate the national attention. And I think it's probably much harder to do that now than it would have been in Marx's time, or even in Luxemburg's time, because back then people actually read books and magazines and stuff, and they weren't constantly, their eyes weren't constantly being drawn to some sort of flickering object or sort of shiny surface or something, But so I think, in a sense, the serious calamitous thing that has to happen probably has to be even more serious and calamitous now than it would have had to be in 1917. But that being said, again, if the AI thing pans out in the way that people seem increasingly to be prognosticating, that might be calamity enough, right? Short of a world war. And it might be possible for that calamity to be a little bit less, destructive in a physical sense and less lethal in a physical sense than an actual war would be. So in a weird, perverse sort of way, that's kind of where my hopes are sort of drifting at this point. I should say my realism tempered hopes. My ultimate hopes would be that we could just do it all through Bernie or something. But again, it's pretty hard to sort of harbor that hope, even if you are metabolically optimistic at this point. So I think that we might have to sort of, basically, it's that old phrase, choose your poison. We might have to choose our poison in full knowledge that it's going to be poison one way or the other. But maybe some poisons are less lethal than others, but just as efficacious in getting us to where we want to go. Is that responsive, Epestian?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we've gone well over what I thought. And thank you so much, Robert, for being so generous with your time.
Oh, thank you guys. I can't tell you what an honor this is.
Discussion.
I mean, it's so great to be in this seat this time, and knowing that I'll be back in my seat with the rest of you guys for our next guest. Thanks for letting me do this.